The dusty streets of Copper Creek buzzed with the usual afternoon chaos when Martha Sullivan stepped off the stagecoach. Her worn brown dress clung to her thin frame, and her hands trembled as she clutched a small leather purse containing her last $3. The sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden buildings lining the main street, casting long shadows that offered little relief from the desert heat. Martha had travelled for 5 days to reach this god-forsaken town, following rumours and whispered stories from saloon keepers and travelling merchants. They all spoke of the same man, a bounty hunter with ice-cold blue eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. A man who had disappeared from her life 15 years ago, leaving behind only broken promises and a heart that never quite healed. The stagecoach driver tossed her single carpetbag onto the dirt road with little care. "This is as far as we go, ma'am," he called down from his seat. "Next coach east ain't for another week." Martha nodded silently, picking up her bag and surveying the rough frontier town. Copper Creek had sprung up around a silver mine that had played out 3 years earlier, that the town stubbornly refused to die. Saloons, gambling halls, and brothels kept the place alive, catering to drifters, outlaws, and men trying to forget their past. She walked slowly down the main street, her eyes scanning every face, every shadowy doorway. The wooden sidewalks creaked under her feet as she passed the general store, the barber shop, and 2 competing saloons whose piano music drifted into the street. Cowboys and miners paid her little attention. Single women weren't uncommon in Copper Creek, though most who came here weren't looking for lost love. At the end of the street stood the sheriff's office, a squat building with iron bars on the windows. Martha hesitated before pushing open the heavy wooden door. A large man with greying hair looked up from behind a desk covered in wanted posters. "Help you, miss?" Sheriff Coleman asked, noting her travel-worn appearance and nervous demeanor. "I'm looking for someone," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A bounty hunter. Goes by the name Jake Morrison." The sheriff's expression changed instantly. His friendly smile faded, replaced by wariness. "Jake Morrison, you say? What business you got with him?" Martha's heart pounded. The sheriff knew him. After all these years of searching, following cold trails and false leads, she had finally found a place where someone knew Jake Morrison. "He's an old friend," she managed to say. Sheriff Coleman studied her face carefully. "Lady, Jake Morrison ain't the kind of man who has lady friends come calling." "You sure you got the right fellow? Tall man, scar on his face, rides a black stallion?" "That's him," Martha whispered. "Where can I find him?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "Well, that's a problem. See, Jake rode out 3 days ago chasing the Dalton gang. Could be gone a week, could be gone a month. Might not come back at all, if you catch my meaning." Martha's legs felt weak. She had spent her last money getting here, had left her job at the boarding house in Kansas City, had traveled alone across dangerous territory. The thought that she might have missed him again was almost too much to bear. "I'll wait," she said firmly. "You got somewhere to stay? Money for room and board?" Martha's silence answered his question. Sheriff Coleman sighed. "Listen, miss. What's your name?" "Martha Sullivan." "Miss Sullivan, I don't know what history you've got with Jake Morrison, but he ain't the same man he might have been 15 years ago. Bounty hunting changes a man, hardens him. Whatever you're hoping to find here, you might want to consider heading back where you came from." But Martha shook her head. "I can't leave, not without seeing him." The sheriff studied her determined expression and seemed to make a decision. "My wife runs a boarding house 2 streets over. Clean rooms, decent food. I'll speak to her about giving you work in exchange for lodging until Morrison gets back." Martha's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Sheriff Coleman. I won't cause any trouble. See that you don't. This is a rough town, Miss Sullivan. Keep to yourself and stay out of the saloons after dark." The Coleman boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that seemed wildly out of place in the harsh desert town. Mrs. Coleman was a plump, kind-hearted woman who asked few questions but had sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Sheriff says you're looking for Jake Morrison," she said as she showed Martha to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. "That man's got a reputation, and not all of it's good." Martha sat heavily on the narrow bed. "What kind of reputation?" "Mrs. Dan," Coleman hesitated. "He's the best tracker in 3 territories, I'll give him that. Never met an outlaw he couldn't find. But he's hard as nails, cold as winter morning. Drinks alone, talks to no one, unless it's business. Been that way since he came here 2 years ago. Does he ever mention his past? Where he came from before? Far as anyone knows, Jake Morrison sprung up out of the desert like a tumbleweed. No family, no friends, no history. That night, Martha lay awake staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of Copper Creek's nightlife. Piano music, laughter, occasional gunshots, and the clip-clop of horses carrying late-night visitors to and from the saloons. She thought about the last time she had seen Jake, 15 years ago in St. Louis. They had been planning to marry. Jake worked as a deputy sheriff then, an honest man with dreams of starting a ranch somewhere out west. But everything changed the night the Brennan gang robbed the bank. Jake had been part of the posse that went after them, and what happened during that chase had transformed him into someone Martha barely recognized. When Jake returned from that pursuit, he was different, haunted. He wouldn't talk about what had happened, wouldn't look her in the eye. 3 days later, he left St. Louis without a word, leaving only a brief note saying he wasn't the man she deserved to marry. For years, Martha had tried to move on. She had even accepted a proposal from Thomas Wheeler, a kind banker who promised her security and comfort. But on their wedding day, she couldn't go through with it. She kept thinking about Jake's laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he held her hand during their evening walks along the Mississippi River. Now, 15 years later, she was in a frontier town waiting for a man who might not even remember her name. The next morning, Mrs. Coleman put Martha to work helping with the laundry, cooking, and cleaning. The work was hard but honest, and it helped keep her mind off the weight. She learned that several people in town knew Jake Morrison by reputation, but none knew him personally. "He's a ghost," said Pete, the blacksmith, when Martha carefully brought up Jake's name while picking up mended sheets. "Comes into town quiet-like, collects his wanted posters from the sheriff, stocks up on supplies and disappears again. Never says more than necessary. Heard he killed 12 men in a single day down in Tucson," added Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store. Course, they were all members of the Satan's Ridge gang, so folks figured they had it coming. Martha tried to reconcile these stories with the gentleman she had once loved. The Jake Morrison she knew had been quick to laugh, slow to anger, always ready to help a neighbor in need. This legendary bounty hunter sounded like a different person entirely. Days turned into a week, then 2 weeks. Martha fell into a routine of work and waiting, scanning every rider who came down the main street, hoping to see a familiar face. Sheriff Coleman checked in on her regularly, and she could see the pity in his eyes growing stronger each day. "Maybe it's time to consider other options," he suggested one evening as Martha swept the front porch of the boarding house. "There's a school teacher position open in Flagstaff. Nice town, good people. You could make a fresh start." But Martha refused to give up. "He'll come back. I know he will." On a Tuesday morning in late September, Martha was hanging laundry behind the boarding house when she heard commotion from the main street, horses' hooves, men shouting, the sound of a crowd gathering. She dropped the wet sheet she was holding and ran toward the front of the building. A small group of riders was making its way down the dusty street, 3 men on horseback, moving slowly, deliberately. The lead rider sat tall in his saddle, his face hidden beneath the brim of a black hat. A black stallion pranced beneath him, and Martha's heart stopped. Even from a distance, even after 15 years, she knew that silhouette. The broad shoulders, the way he held his head, the confident manner in which he controlled his horse. Jake Morrison had returned to Copper Creek. Martha pressed herself against the corner of the building, watching as the small procession made its way toward the sheriff's office. As they drew closer, she could see that the 2 men riding behind Jake were slumped over their saddles, their hands tied behind their backs. Captured outlaws, no doubt, worth substantial bounties. Jake dismounted in front of the sheriff's office with fluid grace. He removed his hat, and Martha got her first clear look at his face in 15 years. Her breath caught in her throat. He was older, certainly. His dark hair now showed streaks of grey, and deep lines marked the corners of his eyes. But it was the hardness in his expression that shocked her most. The warmth and humour she remembered were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to assess everything around him as a potential threat. The scar Sheriff Coleman had mentioned ran from his left temple to his jawline, a pale line against sun-weathered skin. Martha wondered how he had gotten it, what violence had marked him in the years since he left St. Louis. Jake spoke briefly with Sheriff Coleman, his voice too low for Martha to hear from her hiding place. Money changed hands, and the two captured men were led into the jail. Within minutes, Jake was back on his horse, apparently preparing to leave town again. Martha's heart raced. She couldn't let him leave without speaking to him, not after coming so far and waiting so long. But what would she say? How do you approach a man who had walked out of your life without explanation and become a legend in the process? She watched as Jake guided his horse toward the livery stable, probably to arrange for feed and rest. This might be her only chance. Martha smoothed her dress with trembling hands and stepped out from behind the building. The walk to the livery stable felt like the longest journey of her life. Each step brought her closer to the man she had loved and lost, the man she had spent 15 years trying to forget. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone in town could hear it. Jake was unsaddling his horse when Martha reached the stable entrance. He moved with practiced efficiency, every motion economical and purposeful. The black stallion stood perfectly still, trained to obedience by a master horseman. Martha stood in the doorway, gathering courage. The afternoon sun slanted through the stable windows, casting golden bars of light across the hay-strewn floor. Dust motes danced in the warm air, and somewhere in the building, a horse nickered softly. Finally, Jake sensed her presence. He turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip. When he saw her, his entire body went rigid. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at each other across 15 years of separation. Two people who had once shared everything, now reduced to strangers. Martha searched his face for any sign of the man she had loved, any hint of warmth or recognition. Jake's expression remained unreadable. Martha, her name on his lips after so many years, nearly broke her composure. "Hello, Jake. What are you doing here?" His voice was flat, emotionless. "I came to find you." Jake turned back to his horse, resuming his work with the saddle. "Well, you found me. Now you can leave." The coldness in his tone was like a physical blow. Martha had prepared herself for many possible reactions: surprise, anger, even joy. But this icy indifference was worse than anything she had imagined. "I'm not leaving," she said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Not until we talk." Nothing to talk about. Jake didn't look at her as he spoke. That was a lifetime ago. Different people, different world. "Not for me," Martha said quietly. "I never stopped." "Never stopped what?" Jake spun around, and for the first time, she saw emotion in his eyes. Anger, pain, something that might have been fear. "Never stopped hoping? Never stopped waiting?" "Well, you should have. The man you knew is dead, Martha. Has been for 15 years. I don't believe that." Jake's laugh was bitter. "You should. That man was weak, full of dreams and noble ideas. This world doesn't have room for men like that. It chews them up and spits them out." Martha took a step closer. "What happened, Jake? What changed you so much?" For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked. Pain flashed across his features, quickly suppressed, but not before Martha saw it. Whatever had happened to transform Jake Morrison from the gentleman she loved into this hardened bounty hunter had cut him deeply. "It doesn't matter," he said finally. "What matters is that you need to leave Copper Creek. Tonight. Take the next stage east and don't look back." "I can't do that." "Yes, you can. You did it before." Martha felt anger rising in her chest. "I didn't leave you, Jake. You left me. You walked away without explanation, without giving me a chance to help, without trusting me enough to share whatever demons were driving you away." Jake's jaw tightened. "I saved you from a life of misery. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" Martha's voice rose. "I spent 15 years wondering what I did wrong, wondering if you were alive or dead, wondering if the love we shared meant anything to you at all. You want me to be grateful for that? Better than the alternative. Which is what, exactly?"
"Being married to you. Having a family with you."
"Building a life together like we planned?" Jake's control finally snapped. He slammed his fist against the stable wall, causing his horse to shy away nervously. "You want to know what happened? Fine, I'll tell you what happened, and then maybe you'll understand why you need to stay as far away from me as possible." Martha waited, her heart racing. After 15 years, she was finally going to learn the truth about why Jake had left her. "The Brennan gang," Jake began, his voice low and rough. "4 men who robbed banks and killed anyone who got in their way. We tracked them for 3 days through the worst country you can imagine. When we finally caught up with them, They had taken a family hostage, a farmer named Henderson, his wife, and 2 little girls. Jake's hands clenched into fists as he continued. The gang leader, Tom Brennan, said he'd kill the family if we didn't let them go. Sheriff Morrison, no relation, just coincidence. He wanted to negotiate. But I was young, full of righteous anger. I thought I could be a hero. Martha watched as 15 years of suppressed guilt and pain played across Jake's face. I took a shot at Tom Brennan when I thought I had a clear target, missed him by inches and hit little Sarah Henderson instead. 8 years old, with pigtails and a blue dress. I killed an innocent child, Martha. The very people I was supposed to protect. The stable fell silent, except for the gentle sounds of horses moving in their stalls. Martha felt tears running down her cheeks as she finally understood the weight Jake had been carrying all these years. It was an accident, she whispered. Was it? Jake's voice was filled with self-loathing. Or was it the arrogance of a young deputy who thought he was faster and smarter than everyone else? The Brennan gang escaped in the confusion. They killed 2 more families before we caught them again. All because I couldn't wait, couldn't follow orders, couldn't admit that maybe I wasn't cut out to be a hero. Jake turned away from her, staring out the stable door at the dusty street beyond. That night, I saw that little girl's face in my dreams. I've seen it every night since. I realized that everyone I cared about, everyone who depended on me, was in danger, because I wasn't the good man I thought I was. I was dangerous, reckless, full of pride that got innocent people killed. Martha wanted to go to him, to put her arms around him and tell him it wasn't his fault. But she could see in the rigid line of his shoulders that he wouldn't accept comfort, wouldn't allow himself to be forgiven. So I left, Jake continued. Left the badge, left the dreams of being a rancher, left you before my failures could destroy your life too. Became a bounty hunter because at least when I kill someone now, they deserve it. At least now the mistakes I make only hurt outlaws and murderers. Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You should have told me. We could have worked through it together. Jake shook his head. No, we couldn't. Because you would have tried to convince me it wasn't my fault, that I was still a good man worth loving. And maybe for a while, I would have believed you. But sooner or later, my nature would have shown itself again. Sooner or later, I would have hurt you the way I hurt that little girl. That's not true, isn't it? Jake finally turned to face her again, and Martha was shocked by the emptiness in his eyes. Do you know what I've done in the 15 years since I left you? I've killed 27 men. Not in fair fights or dramatic showdowns like in the dime novels. I've tracked them down like animals and put bullets in their backs when they tried to run. I've slept in the rain, eaten cold beans for weeks at a time, and learned to trust no one because trust gets you killed in this business. Jake took a step toward her, and Martha saw something dangerous flicker in his expression. I've become exactly what this territory needs. A killer who only kills other killers. But that's not the man you fell in love with, Martha. That man died the day he pulled the trigger and murdered an innocent child. Martha met his gaze steadily. I don't believe that. I see pain in your eyes, Jake, not evil. I see a man who's been punishing himself for 15 years for one terrible mistake. One mistake that cost a child her life. One mistake that's cost you your life. Martha replied, You've been living like a dead man, cutting yourself off from everything good in the world because you think you don't deserve happiness. Jake's expression hardened again. Maybe I don't. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Not everyone. Some people cross lines that can't be uncrossed. Martha felt her desperation growing. She had found Jake at last, but he was slipping away from her again, retreating behind walls of guilt and self-hatred that seemed impossible to breach. What about the families of the men you brought to justice, she asked. Don't they deserve to sleep peacefully, knowing their loved ones' killers are behind bars or in the ground? What about the innocent people those outlaws would have hurt if you hadn't stopped them? That's just my job. No, it's more than that. You've dedicated your life to protecting people, even if you won't admit it, even if you've convinced yourself you're just a killer. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he spoke in a voice so low Martha had to strain to hear him. It doesn't matter what I tell myself about justice or protection. Every man I kill, I see Sarah Henderson's face. Every time I draw my gun, I remember that split second when I thought I was doing the right thing and ended up destroying an innocent life. Martha took a deep breath. This was her moment, her chance to reach the man she loved beneath all the pain and guilt. Jake Morrison, she said firmly. Look at me. Something in her tone made him obey. Their eyes met across the dusty stable, and for just an instant, Martha saw a flicker of the gentleman she had once known. "I came here to ask you something," she said, "and I'm going to ask it whether you want to hear it or not." Jake waited, his expression guarded. Martha reached into her small leather purse and pulled out a thin gold band. The wedding ring Jake had given her 15 years ago. The ring she had never been able to bring herself to sell or throw away. "Please," she said, holding out the ring, "name your price. What will it cost for you to give us another chance? What will it take for you to stop punishing yourself and come home with me?" Jake stared at the ring as if it were a snake about to strike. "Martha, you don't understand." "I understand everything," she interrupted. "I understand that you made a mistake that cost a child her life. I understand that you've been carrying that guilt for 15 years. I understand that you've become someone hard and dangerous, but I also understand that underneath all of that, you're still the man who used to read poetry to me by the river, who dreamed of raising horses and having children, who cried when his dog died." Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now, but her voice remained strong. "So name your price, Jake Morrison. Tell me what it will cost to buy back the man I love from the killer he's become." Jake looked at the ring for a long moment, then back at her face. Martha could see the war raging inside him, hope battling despair, love fighting guilt, the desire for redemption struggling against the certainty that he didn't deserve it. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't afford the price, Martha. Nobody can." Martha stared at Jake for a long moment, the golden wedding ring still gleaming in her outstretched palm. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the stable windows, and somewhere in town, a church bell chimed the hour. Time seemed suspended between them, 15 years of separation hanging in the dusty air. "Try me," she said quietly. Jake's eyes flicked from the ring to her face and back again. She could see the internal battle playing out in his expression. Hope warring with despair, longing fighting against the certainty that he didn't deserve a second chance. "Martha, you need to understand something," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not the same man who gave you that ring. That man believed in justice, in right and wrong, in the possibility of building something good in this world. This man," he gestured to himself with bitter self-awareness, "this man knows that good intentions can lead to dead children. This man has learned that sometimes the only way to stop evil is to become something darker than evil itself." But Martha didn't back down. She took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the trail dust on his clothes and see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes that she had once loved to stare into for hours. "Then tell me your price," she repeated. "Whatever it is, I'll find a way to pay it." Jake was quiet for so long that Martha began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid that stopping would rob him of the courage to continue. "The Brennan gang," he said. "Tom Brennan got away that day, and his brother Pete with him. They're still out there, still killing innocent people. Every newspaper I read, every wanted poster I see, every story I hear in saloons, more families destroyed, more children left orphans, more good people dead because I failed to stop them when I had the chance." Martha felt her heart sink. She had expected him to name some impossible financial sum, or perhaps demand that she prove her love through some dramatic gesture. But this was asking her to support what might amount to a suicide mission. "I've been tracking them for 15 years, Jake continued. Getting close, following leads, always arriving just after they've moved on. 3 months ago, I finally got solid information. They're holed up in a box canyon about 100 miles south of here, part of a larger gang that's been terrorizing the Arizona territory. 20 men, maybe more, all killers with prizes on their heads." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "That's my price, Martha. I bring in Tom and Pete Brennan, alive or dead, and maybe, I can look at myself in the mirror without seeing Sarah Henderson's blood on my hands. Maybe then I can believe that I'm worthy of the love you're offering." Martha's mind raced. She had come here prepared to convince Jake to give up his dangerous life, to return with her to civilization and build the peaceful future they had once planned. Instead, he was asking her to wait while he rode into what sounded like certain death. "How do you plan to take 20 men by yourself?" she asked. "Very carefully, and with a lot of luck." "That's not a plan, Jake." "That's suicide." He shrugged, a gesture that broke Martha's heart with its casual acceptance of mortality. "Maybe, but it's the only way I can think of to pay the debt I owe." Martha closed her eyes, trying to think clearly despite the emotions churning inside her. When she opened them again, she saw Jake watching her with an expression that mixed hope and resignation in equal measure. "What if I said no?" she asked. "What if I told you that your price was too high, that I'd rather have you alive and guilty than dead and redeemed?" A sad smile crossed Jake's face, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since his return. For just a moment, she caught a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Then I'd say you were probably the smartest woman in the territory," he said. "And I'd still ride out tomorrow morning to hunt the Brennans, because this isn't really about earning your forgiveness, Martha. It's about learning to live with myself." Martha understood then that she had no real choice. Jake was going after the Brennan gang whether she approved or not. The only question was whether she would support him or spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. "All right," she said quietly. "Your price is accepted." Jake's eyes widened in surprise. "Martha, you don't understand what you're agreeing to. I might not come back. In fact, the odds are pretty good that I won't. Then we'd better make the most of whatever time we have left." For a moment, Jake's carefully maintained composure cracked completely. She saw the vulnerable, frightened man beneath the hard exterior, the boy who had once promised to love her forever standing lost inside the dangerous stranger he had become. "I can't ask you to wait for me again," he whispered. "You're not asking. I'm choosing." Jake stared at her for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took the ring from her palm. His fingers were calloused and scarred, marked by 15 years of hard living, but they trembled slightly as he held the simple gold band up to the fading light. "I gave this to you when I thought I was going to be a rancher," he said. "When I thought we'd have a little house with a garden and maybe a couple of kids running around in the yard. We still can." "Can we?" Jake's voice was full of wonder, as if he was contemplating a miracle. "After everything I've done, everything I've become?" Martha reached out and covered his hands with hers. "People change, Jake. Sometimes for the worse, but sometimes for the better. The question is whether you're willing to try." Jake was quiet for a long time, staring down at their joined hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean closer to hear him. "I don't know how to be anything but what I am now." "Then I'll teach you," Martha said. "The same way you taught me to ride a horse back in St. Louis, remember? I was terrified, certain I'd fall and break my neck. But you were patient with me, showed me how to trust the horse, how to find my balance. We'll do the same thing now, except this time we're learning how to be the people we used to be." A single tear rolled down Jake's weathered cheek. "What if I've forgotten how? Then we'll figure it out together." Jake lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so familiar and yet so strange after 15 years that Martha felt her breath catch. "When I was tracking the Culver gang last winter," he said suddenly, "I got caught in a blizzard up in the mountains. Spent 3 days in a cave, sure I was going to freeze to death. You know what I thought about?" Martha shook her head. "A bit nighty answers. Sunday mornings in St. Louis. Remember how we used to sit on your front porch after church, planning what we'd name our children? You wanted to call our first son William after your father, and I insisted our first daughter had to be named Rose because they were your favorite flowers." Martha's eyes filled with tears. She had forgotten that conversation, lost it somewhere in 15 years of pain and longing. But hearing Jake remember it now with such perfect clarity told her more about his true feelings than any declaration of love could have. "I remember," she whispered. "I've carried those Sunday mornings with me through every bounty hunt, every gunfight, every night I've slept under the stars. They were the only beautiful thing left in my life, Martha. The only reminder that I used to be capable of gentleness." Jake released her hands and carefully slipped the ring into his vest pocket. "I'll wear this over my heart when I ride after the Brennans, and if God sees fit to let me live through it, I'll put it back on your finger and we'll start over." Martha wanted to argue, to insist that the ring belonged on her hand now, not carried into battle like some kind of talisman. But she could see the determination in Jake's eyes and knew that this was something he needed to do, not just for her, but for himself. "How long do you need to prepare?" she asked. "A few days. I want to study the territory. Maybe find some men willing to ride with me for a share of the bounties. Where will you look for help?" Jake's expression darkened. "There's a saloon about 50 miles east of here called the Broken Wheel. It's where men go when they're between jobs, if you catch my meaning." Not the most respectable establishment, but sometimes you need wolves to hunt wolves. Martha nodded, though the idea of Jake allying himself with questionable characters made her stomach turn. I'll wait for you here in Copper Creek. No, Jake said firmly. I want you to go back to Kansas City. If something happens to me, you'll need to rebuild your life somewhere safe. I'm not leaving. Martha. No arguments, Jake Morrison. I waited 15 years to find you again. I'm not going anywhere until I know for certain whether you're coming home to me. Jake studied her face, and Martha could see him recognizing the stubborn determination that had once driven him to distraction during their courtship. A ghost of his old smile flickered across his features. You always were too strong-willed for your own good, he said, and you always were too protective for yours. They stood together in the growing twilight, and for a moment it was as if the 15 years of separation had never happened. They were simply Jake and Martha again, young and in love, and planning a future together, but the moment couldn't last. Jake stepped back, his expression becoming businesslike once more. I'll need to leave day after tomorrow, he said. That gives us tonight and tomorrow to say whatever needs saying. Martha felt panic rising in her chest. After searching for him so long, she was going to lose him again almost immediately. But she forced herself to remain calm. Then we'd better not waste time, she said. Jake nodded. I'll get a room at the hotel. We can have dinner together. Maybe walk around town. Try to remember what it feels like to be normal people instead of a bounty hunter and the woman who's been chasing his ghost. I'd like that. Jake began gathering his gear, preparing to leave the stable. But as he slung his saddlebags over his shoulder, Martha reached out and touched his arm. Jake, that little girl, Sarah Henderson. What happened to her family after the shooting? Jake went very still. Her parents and sister moved back east to live with relatives. I heard the father never recovered, died of a broken heart 2 years later. The mother remarried eventually, had another daughter. They named her Sarah too. And you've been carrying their pain all this time, along with your own. Someone should. Someone should remember what my pride cost them. Martha nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand the full weight of the burden Jake had been carrying. It wasn't just guilt over the accident. It was responsibility for an entire family's destruction, a commitment to bearing their grief because he felt he had no right to set it down. When you face the Brennans, she said quietly, you won't just be fighting for your own redemption. You'll be fighting for Sarah Henderson's memory and for all the people they've hurt since that day. Jake met her eyes, and she saw something shift in his expression. For the first time since their reunion, he looked less like a man preparing to die and more like a warrior preparing for a righteous battle. Yes, he said simply, I will. That night, Martha and Jake had dinner at the hotel restaurant, a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, but it felt like the most elegant feast either of them had ever enjoyed. They talked carefully around the dangerous subjects, instead sharing memories of their time in St. Louis and observations about how much the frontier had changed over the years. Other diners cast curious glances in their direction, wondering about the well-dressed woman dining with the notorious bounty hunter. But Martha ignored the stares, focused entirely on the man across from her. Jake had changed out of his trail clothes into a clean white shirt and black pants, and with his hair combed and his face washed, she could see more clearly the boy she had fallen in love with. The years had marked him, certainly, but beneath the hard exterior, glimpses of his former self kept breaking through. Remember that picnic we had by Miller's Creek? Martha asked as they shared a piece of apple pie. You spent an hour trying to skip stones and couldn't get more than 2 bounces. Jake laughed, and the sound was like music to Martha's ears. I blamed it on the rocks being the wrong shape. You told me it was because I was showing off instead of paying attention to the water. You were always showing off when you were nervous. Was I that obvious? Only to me. I thought it was charming. Jake's expression grew serious. I haven't felt charming in a very long time, Martha. I'm not sure I remember how to be the man you fell in love with. Martha reached across the table and took his hand. Then don't try to be him. Be the man you are now, but let yourself believe that you deserve happiness. That's harder than it sounds. I know. But we have the rest of tonight and all day tomorrow to practice. After dinner, they walked slowly through Copper Creek's dusty streets. The town was settling into its evening rhythm. Cowboys heading into saloons, families gathering on front porches to escape the heat, children playing one last game before bedtime. It was a rough place, but there was life here, hope for the future despite the harsh conditions. "It's not so different from some of the towns we talked about settling in," Martha observed as they paused in front of the church at the end of Main Street. "No," Jake agreed, "though I imagined we'd choose somewhere with better schools for our children." The casual reference to the family they had once planned hit Martha like a physical blow. For a moment, she could almost see the life they might have had, children with Jake's blue eyes and her stubborn chin. Sunday dinners with friends and neighbors, Jake coming home each evening to a house filled with laughter and love. "We could still have that," she said softly. "After you come back from hunting the Brennans, we could find a place like that and start over." Jake was quiet for a long time. "Do you think it's possible? Do you think people can really leave their past behind and become someone new? I think people can choose who they want to be going forward. The past doesn't disappear, but it doesn't have to define everything that comes after." They stood together in the gathering darkness, and Martha felt Jake's internal struggle as if it were her own. 15 years of guilt and self-punishment, warring against the possibility of forgiveness and redemption, hope battling despair for control of his future. Finally, Jake turned to her, his face pale in the moonlight. "If I don't come back, you will. But if I don't, I need you to know something. These 15 years away from you have been the longest, loneliest years of my life. Not a day has passed that I haven't regretted walking away. Not a night has passed that I haven't dreamed of holding you again." Martha felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "And why did you stay away? Why didn't you come back?" "Because I was afraid," Jake admitted. "Afraid that you'd see what I'd become and realize you were better off without me. Afraid that I'd bring my darkness into your life and destroy your chance at happiness with someone better." "There is no one better, Jake. There never has been." Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "I love you, Martha Sullivan. I've loved you every day for 15 years, even when I was trying to convince myself I didn't deserve to love anyone. I love you too, Jake Morrison, more than I did 15 years ago, because now I understand what it costs to love someone enough to let them go." Jake leaned down and kissed her then, softly at first and then with all the passion and longing of their long separation. Martha melted into his arms, feeling for the first time since he left that she was truly home. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jake rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if he was trying to memorize the moment. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "I want you to know that finding you here—" "It's not enough," Martha said fiercely. "A few stolen hours isn't enough to make up for 15 years, Jake. You have to come back to me. You have to." Jake kissed her forehead gently. "I'll try, Martha. I promise I'll try." The next day passed in a blur of preparation and precious stolen moments. Jake spent the morning gathering supplies and information, while Martha helped Mrs. Coleman with the boarding house work and tried not to watch the clock. But in the afternoon, they walked together to the edge of town and sat by a small creek that reminded them both of the place where they used to meet in St. Louis. "Tell me about your plan," Martha said as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Jake was quiet for a moment, skipping stones in the creek with the same patient concentration she remembered from their youth. "The Brennan hideout is in Devil's Canyon, about a day-and-a-half ride south. It's good defensive ground, only one way in or out. High walls on 3 sides. That's why they chose it. How do you plan to get past 20 men?" "I'm hoping I won't have to. There's a trading post about 10 miles from the canyon where information can be bought for the right price. If I can find out when Tom and Pete might be away from the main camp, maybe I can take them without having to fight the whole gang." Martha nodded, though she could hear the uncertainty in Jake's voice. "And if they're all together?" Jake's expression grew grim. "Then I'll have to be very creative. Or you could wait. Watch them for weeks or months until you get a better opportunity." No," Jake said firmly. "I've been waiting 15 years for this chance. I won't spend another winter wondering if this is the year the Brennans kill another family, because I was too cautious to act." Martha understood, but that didn't make it easier to accept. She watched Jake skip another stone across the water and tried to memorize every detail. The way the afternoon sun caught the grey in his hair, the concentration in his blue eyes, the gentle strength in his hands. "I brought you something," she said suddenly, reaching into her dress pocket. Jake looked up curiously as Martha pulled out a small leather-bound book. "My father's Bible," she explained. "I've carried it with me everywhere since he died. I'd like you to take it with you. Jake accepted the book reverently, running his fingers over the worn leather cover. Martha, I'm not sure I'm the right man to be carrying a Bible. You're exactly the right man. Someone who understands the weight of sin and the need for redemption. Someone who's been searching for forgiveness for 15 years. Jake opened the book carefully and found a pressed flower between the pages. A rose, dried but still recognizable. From your garden in St. Louis. Martha nodded. I picked it the morning you left. I've kept it all these years as a reminder of what we had. Jake touched the fragile petals gently. I'll bring it back to you. Bring yourself back to me. The flower's just a symbol. That evening, they had their second and final dinner together at the hotel. This time, the conversation was more serious, filled with plans and promises and the kind of desperate intensity that comes with knowing time is running out. When I get back, Jake said as they lingered over coffee, we'll go somewhere new, maybe California, or up to Oregon Territory, somewhere we can start fresh where nobody knows Jake Morrison, the bounty hunter. What about Jake Morrison, the husband and father? Martha asked. Jake's eyes lit up with an expression she hadn't seen since their reunion. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Him too. Especially him. They spent their last night together sitting on the hotel porch talking and planning and simply enjoying each other's presence. As dawn approached, Jake's expression grew more serious, the reality of what lay ahead settling over him like a heavy cloak. I have to ask you one more time, he said as the eastern sky began to lighten. Are you sure you want to wait here? It could be weeks before I return, and there's always a chance. I'm sure, Martha interrupted. I've spent 15 years wondering where you were and whether you were all right. I'm not spending another day in that kind of uncertainty if I can help it. Jake nodded, accepting her decision. As the sun crested the horizon, painting Copper Creek in shades of gold and pink, he stood and offered Martha his hand. Walk with me to the stable? Martha took his hand without hesitation. Together, they made their way through the awakening town to where Jake's black stallion waited, saddled and ready for the journey ahead. Jake checked his gear one final time. Rifle, ammunition, food and water for several days. The small leather Bible Martha had given him tucked safely in his saddlebag. Everything he needed for what might be the most important hunt of his career. As he prepared to mount his horse, Martha stepped forward and straightened his collar with trembling fingers. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks. I promise to come back to you, Jake said, catching her hands and holding them against his chest. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I will come back. Jake mounted his horse and looked down at Martha, memorizing her face in the morning light. Then he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out her wedding ring, holding it up so the gold caught the sun. This is coming home with me, he said firmly, and when it does, it's never leaving your hand again. Martha pressed her hand to her lips and then reached up to touch his boot. Ride safe, my love. Come home to me. Jake spurred his horse into motion, and Martha watched him ride out of Copper Creek as the sun climbed higher into the desert sky. She stood in front of the stable long after he disappeared from sight, her heart full of love and terror in equal measure. Behind her, Sheriff Coleman approached quietly. He's a good man, Miss Sullivan. Whatever demons he's been fighting, he's still a good man underneath. I know, Martha whispered. I just hope he knows it too. As Jake Morrison rode toward his destiny with the Brennan gang, Martha Sullivan began the hardest weight of her life, not knowing if the man she loved would return as her husband or become another victim of the violent frontier justice he had chosen to serve. 3 weeks passed like 3 years for Martha Sullivan. Each morning she woke, hoping to see a familiar silhouette riding down Copper Creek's main street. Each evening she went to bed with the same knot of anxiety in her stomach, wondering if Jake was still alive somewhere in the vast Arizona territory. She kept busy helping Mrs. Coleman at the boarding house, but her mind was always elsewhere, following dusty trails through desert mountains, imagining gunfights in box canyons, wondering if the man she loved was lying wounded somewhere under the stars. Sheriff Coleman brought her what news he could gather from passing travelers and telegraph messages from other towns. The Brennan gang had been spotted near Tombstone 2 weeks ago, then vanished again into the wilderness. No one had seen Jake Morrison, but then again, no one ever saw Jake until he was ready to be seen. No news is good news in this business, Sheriff Coleman told Martha one evening as she swept the jailhouse steps. If Jake was dead, word would travel fast. Bounty hunters have a way of becoming legends when they die, and Jake Morrison's already enough of a legend that his death would be big news. Martha took what comfort she could from his words, but the waiting was wearing on her. She had lost weight, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Mrs. Coleman worried about her constantly, bringing her extra portions at meals and trying to keep her spirits up with cheerful conversation. "You need to take care of yourself," Mrs. Coleman scolded one morning as Martha picked at her breakfast. "What good will you be to Jake if he comes back to find you wasted away to nothing?" "I can't eat when I don't know if he's—" Martha began, then stopped herself. Saying the words out loud would make them too real. "If he's what?" "Dead." "Honey, if Jake Morrison was dead, don't you think you'd feel it in your heart? After loving someone for 15 years, even separated, don't you think you'd know?" Martha considered this. In truth, despite her worry and fear, she didn't feel the deep, soul-crushing despair she imagined would accompany Jake's death. There was still hope burning inside her, still a sense that somewhere out there, he was fighting his way back to her. "Maybe," she admitted. "More than maybe." "Now eat your eggs before they get cold." On a Thursday morning in early October, Martha was hanging laundry behind the boarding house when she heard commotion from the main street, horses arriving, men shouting, the kind of excitement that usually meant either very good news or very bad news. Martha dropped the wet sheet she was holding and ran toward the front of the building. A small crowd had gathered in front of the sheriff's office, and through the press of people she could see several horses tied to the hitching post. Her heart pounded as she pushed through the crowd, searching for any sign of Jake. But the men dismounting were strangers, dusty, travel-worn riders with the hard look of bounty hunters. One of them, a tall man with a graying beard, was talking animatedly to Sheriff Coleman. "Biggest gunfight I ever seen," the bearded man was saying. "Jake Morrison and 2 other fellas took on the whole Brennan gang in Devil's Canyon. Must have been 20 shots fired in the first 10 seconds. Martha felt the world tilt around her. She grabbed the arm of the man nearest to her, a local shopkeeper named Williams. "What happened?" she whispered. "Is Jake Morrison?" Williams looked down at her with a mixture of pity and excitement. "Don't know yet, miss. These boys just rode in from the canyon. Sounds like there was quite a fight." Martha pushed closer to the sheriff and the bounty hunters, desperate to hear every word. "Found Jake's horse about 5 miles from the canyon," the bearded man was continuing. "Black stallion, still saddled but riderless. Blood on the saddle too, though not much of it." Sheriff Coleman's face was grim. "Any sign of Jake himself?" "That's the strange part. We searched the whole area but never found a body." "Course, there was a lot of bodies to sort through. The Brennan gang's finished. Most of them dead. The rest scattered to the winds. Tom and Pete Brennan are definitely among the deceased, but no sign of Jake Morrison anywhere." Martha felt her knees go weak. Mrs. Coleman appeared beside her, steadying her with a strong arm. "Could he have survived?" Sheriff Coleman asked. The bearded bounty hunter shrugged. "Maybe. Like I said, we found his horse but no body. Could be he's holed up somewhere licking his wounds. Could be he's lying dead in a ravine we didn't search. Hard to say." "What about the other men who rode with him?" "Both dead. Found them in the canyon with the rest. Good men, fought well from what I could tell. But Jake Morrison..." The bounty hunter shook his head. "That man's either the luckiest son of a gun in the territory or the unluckiest, depending on how you look at it." Martha couldn't listen to any more speculation. She turned and walked quickly back to the boarding house, Mrs. Coleman hurrying to keep up with her. "Now don't you go jumping to conclusions, Mrs. DeCepo," Coleman said as they climbed the steps to the front porch. "You heard what that man said. Nobody means there's still hope. His horse came back without him, with blood on the saddle," Martha replied, her voice hollow. "What hope is there in that? Plenty. Maybe Jake was wounded and found shelter somewhere. Maybe he's making his way back to town on foot. Maybe his horse got spooked and ran off while he was tending to his wounds." Martha wanted to believe, but the image of Jake's riderless horse kept playing in her mind. In all the years she had known him, Jake had never been separated from his horse except by choice. If the stallion had returned without him, it could only mean something terrible had happened. That night, Martha couldn't sleep. She paced her small room, staring out the window at the empty street below, willing Jake to appear out of the darkness. When she finally dozed fitfully in her chair, she dreamed of gunfights and blood and Jake calling her name from some unreachable distance. The next morning brought another group of travelers with more details about the fight at Devil's Canyon. The story that emerged was both heroic and heartbreaking. Jake Morrison had indeed tracked the Brennan gang to their hideout. But instead of waiting for a better opportunity as Martha had hoped, he had recruited 2 other bounty hunters and launched a direct assault. The 3 men had ridden into the canyon at dawn, catching the outlaws by surprise, but finding themselves hopelessly outnumbered. The fight had been fierce but brief. When it was over, 18 members of the Brennan gang lay dead, including the brothers Tom and Pete, who had haunted Jake's nightmares for 15 years. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. Jake's 2 companions were dead, and Jake himself had vanished without a trace. Some folks are saying he was wounded so bad he crawled off to die somewhere private, said Pete the blacksmith, who had been talking to the latest group of travelers. Others think maybe he fell in the river that runs through the canyon and got washed downstream. Martha listened to the speculation with growing despair. Each new theory seemed more hopeless than the last. But Sheriff Coleman wasn't ready to give up. "I'm organizing a search party," he announced. "Any man who's willing can ride out to Devil's Canyon and help look for Jake Morrison. He's done this territory a service by finishing the Brennan gang, and we owe him our best effort to find him." A dozen men volunteered, including several who had never particularly liked Jake but respected what he had accomplished. They rode out the next morning with supplies for a week-long search, promising to cover every inch of ground within 20 miles of the canyon. Martha begged to go with them, but Sheriff Coleman refused. "It's dangerous country, Miss Sullivan, and we'll be moving fast and rough. You'd slow us down, and Jake would never forgive me if I let something happen to you." So Martha waited again, this time with even less information than before. The search party was supposed to be gone a week, but days stretched into 2 weeks with no word. Martha began to fear that she had lost not only Jake, but also the dozen good men who had ridden out to find him. Finally, on a cold morning in late October, the search party returned. Martha could tell from their faces that the news wasn't good. They had found evidence of Jake's presence in the canyon, spent shell casings, drops of blood, even a piece of torn shirt caught on a thorn bush, but they had found no trace of Jake himself, alive or dead. "We covered every inch of that canyon and 10 miles in every direction," Sheriff Coleman reported wearily. "If Jake Morrison is in that country, he's hidden where no man can find him." Martha felt the last of her hope beginning to fade. It had been almost a month since Jake had ridden out of Copper Creek. Even if he had survived the battle with the Brennans, could he have lived this long with serious wounds and no medical attention? "What do we do now?" she asked. Sheriff Coleman's weathered face was full of sympathy. "I'm sorry, Miss Sullivan. I think it's time to accept that Jake Morrison isn't coming back." That evening, Martha sat alone on the hotel porch where she and Jake had spent their last night together. The autumn air was crisp, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She pulled Jake's coat, the one he had left behind, more tightly around her shoulders and tried to imagine what her life would be like now. She couldn't stay in Copper Creek indefinitely. Mrs. Coleman had been kind, but Martha couldn't live on charity forever. She would have to make decisions about her future, about where to go, and how to rebuild her life once again. The thought of leaving felt like a betrayal. What if Jake was alive somewhere, making his way back to her? What if he returned to Copper Creek to find her gone, just as she had once returned to St. Louis to find him vanished? But she couldn't wait forever. Already, the money she had saved was running low, and winter was coming to the high desert country. If she was going to leave, it would have to be soon. Martha was still wrestling with her decision when she heard the sound of a horse walking slowly down the main street. She looked up without much interest. Travelers arrived in Copper Creek at all hours, and most had nothing to do with her. But something about the slow, measured pace of this particular horse made her pay attention. In the moonlight, she could see a lone rider hunched forward in his saddle, moving as if every step caused pain. The horse itself looked exhausted, its head hanging low as it plodded through the dust. Martha stood up, her heart beginning to race. There was something familiar about the silhouette, something that made her breath catch in her throat. The rider drew closer, passing under a street lamp that cast yellow light across his face. Martha saw a beard she didn't recognize, clothes that were torn and dirty beyond recognition. A man who looked like he had been through hell and barely survived. But the eyes were unmistakably Jake Morrison's. "Jake," Martha whispered, afraid to believe what she was seeing. The rider looked up at the sound of her voice. and his face transformed with an expression of such relief and joy that Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. "Martha," Jake said, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "You waited." Martha ran down the hotel steps and into the street, not caring about propriety or the curious faces that were beginning to appear in windows and doorways. Jake tried to dismount but nearly fell, and Martha caught him as his knees buckled. Up close, she could see the extent of his injuries. His left arm was bound against his chest with makeshift splints and bandages. A deep cut on his forehead had healed crookedly, and he was thinner than she had ever seen him. But he was alive, and he was home. "I thought you were dead," Martha sobbed, supporting his weight as best she could. "Your horse came back weeks ago, and the search party couldn't find any trace of you." Jake managed a weak smile. "Horse got spooked during the fight and ran off. Took me this long to walk out of the canyon country and find another mount." "You walked? For 3 weeks with those injuries?" "Had something to come back to," Jake said simply. "Couldn't die until I kept my promise." By now, a crowd had gathered around them. Sheriff Coleman appeared, took one look at Jake's condition, and immediately began barking orders. "Someone get Doc Patterson. Pete, help me get Jake to the hotel. Mrs. Coleman, bring hot water and clean bandages." But Jake resisted their help, his eyes fixed on Martha's face. With his good hand, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out her wedding ring, somehow still intact after his ordeal. "Told you this was coming home with me," he said, holding the ring out to her with shaking fingers. Martha took the ring with trembling hands, then looked into Jake's eyes that were no longer haunted by 15 years of guilt and self-hatred. The demons that had driven him into the wilderness seemed to have been left behind in Devil's Canyon along with the bodies of the Brennan gang. "The price has been paid," Jake said quietly, his voice gaining strength. "Tom and Pete Brennan are dead. Sarah Henderson can rest in peace, and I can finally come home." Martha slipped the ring onto her finger where it belonged, where it had always belonged. "Welcome home, Jake Morrison." As the doctor arrived and began examining Jake's injuries, Martha learned the full story of his miraculous survival. The battle in Devil's Canyon had indeed been as fierce as reported, with Jake and his 2 companions facing overwhelming odds. But Jake's 15 years of experience as a bounty hunter had served him well. While his partners fought bravely but conventionally, Jake had used every dirty trick he knew to stay alive. When the shooting started, Jake had taken cover behind a fallen log and picked off the Brennan gang members one by one. Tom and Pete Brennan, the men who had haunted his nightmares, had died in the first exchange of gunfire, not in some dramatic final confrontation, but simply and decisively, the way most frontier justice was dispensed. But just as the fight seemed won, Jake's horse had been spooked by a ricocheting bullet and had bolted from the canyon, leaving him stranded in hostile territory with a broken arm and various other wounds. Rather than risk infection by staying in the canyon with the dead bodies, Jake had gathered what supplies he could and began the long journey home on foot. "Took me 2 weeks just to get out of the mountain country," Jake told Martha as Doc Patterson bandaged his wounds. "Had to avoid the trails in case any of the gang members who escaped were laying ambushes. Lived on cactus fruit and what small game I could catch." "How did you find another horse?" Martha asked. Jake's expression grew sheepish. "Met a Mexican trader about 50 miles east of here. Good man. But he drove a hard bargain. Cost me everything I had, including the bounty money from the Brennan gang." Martha didn't care about the money. She didn't care that Jake looked like a scarecrow, or that his beard needed trimming, or that he smelled like he hadn't bathed in weeks. He was alive. He was home. And the haunted look that had defined him for 15 years was finally gone. Doc Patterson pronounced Jake lucky to be alive, but confident that he would make a full recovery with proper rest and care. The broken arm would heal cleanly, the various cuts and bruises were already mending, and the weight he had lost could be regained with good food and time. "What you need most is sleep," the doctor told Jake. "Real sleep in a real bed, not whatever you've been doing for the past month." But Jake shook his head. "First, I need to do something I should have done 15 years ago." Despite his exhaustion and injuries, Jake insisted on getting cleaned up and dressed in his best clothes. Martha waited in the hotel lobby while he bathed and shaved, transforming himself from a wild man of the desert back into the Jake Morrison she remembered. When he emerged from his room, Martha barely recognized him. Gone was the haunted bounty hunter with the cold eyes and bitter smile. In his place stood a man who looked younger despite his ordeal. a man whose blue eyes sparkled with life and hope and love. Jake offered Martha his good arm. "Will you walk with me, Miss Sullivan?" Martha took his arm, curious about where he was leading her. Together they walked through Copper Creek streets as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their destination turned out to be the small church at the end of Main Street. Jake pushed open the wooden door and led Martha inside, where a few candles provided flickering light in the gathering darkness. "Reverend Williams," Jake called out. An elderly man emerged from the back of the church, his face lighting up when he saw them. "Jake Morrison!" "Thank the Lord you're alive. The whole town's been talking about nothing else." "Reverend, I have a favor to ask," Jake said formally. "I'd like you to marry me and Miss Sullivan, tonight if possible." Martha's eyes widened in surprise. "Jake, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Jake interrupted gently. "I've wasted 15 years running from happiness, Martha. I'm not going to waste another day." Reverend Williams beamed. "I'd be honored to perform the ceremony. Let me get my Bible and call my wife as a witness." Within an hour, a small crowd had gathered in the candlelit church. Coleman had brought Martha a simple white dress that had belonged to her daughter, and Sheriff Coleman had agreed to stand up for Jake despite his broken arm. The whole town seemed to have turned out to witness the wedding of the legendary bounty hunter and the woman who had tracked him across half the territory. As Martha walked down the short aisle toward where Jake waited at the altar, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 15 years of separation, a desperate search across the frontier, a seemingly impossible love story that had somehow found its way to a happy ending. Jake was waiting for her with tears in his eyes, the wedding ring ready in his good hand. When Reverend Williams asked if he, Jake Morrison, would take Martha Sullivan as his lawfully wedded wife, Jake's voice rang out clear and strong. "I will." I'd been waiting 15 years to say those words again. And when Martha was asked the same question, she smiled through her tears and gave the answer she had been carrying in her heart through all the lonely years. "I will." I never stopped believing this day would come. As they exchanged rings and promises in the flickering candlelight, Martha thought about the price they had both paid to reach this moment. Jake had faced his demons in Devil's Canyon and emerged victorious, while she had crossed the frontier alone to find the love she had never been able to forget. The price had been high: 15 years of separation, countless tears, and the near loss of the man she loved. But as Jake kissed her for the first time as her husband, Martha knew it had all been worth it. Outside the church, Copper Creek's residents had organized an impromptu celebration. Someone had brought a fiddle, someone else had contributed a bottle of good whiskey, and soon the entire main street was alive with music and laughter and dancing. Jake and Martha shared their first dance as husband and wife under the desert stars, moving slowly because of his injuries, but perfectly in harmony after all the years apart. "So what now?" Martha asked as they swayed to the music. "Where do we go from here?" Jake smiled, and Martha saw in his expression the man she had fallen in love with in St. Barth, Louis, the gentle, hopeful man who had dreamed of raising horses and having children and building a life filled with simple pleasures. "I was thinking about Oregon," he said. "Good farmland up there, not too many people, nice climate. We could find ourselves a piece of land and build that house we used to talk about. With a garden, especially with a garden." "I remember you wanted roses." Martha laughed, thinking of the pressed flower she had given Jake, the flower that had somehow survived his ordeal in Devil's Canyon and his long journey home.
What about your career as a bounty hunter?
Jake's expression grew serious. "That chapter of my life is over, Martha. I paid the debt I owed to Sarah Henderson and her family. Now I want to spend the rest of my days creating life instead of taking it." "Creating life?" Jake's eyes twinkled with mischief and love. "Well, we always did plan to have children, and we're not getting any younger." Martha felt her cheeks flush, but she couldn't stop smiling. "I suppose we do have some catching up to do. 15 years worth." As the night wore on and the celebration began to wind down, Jake and Martha slipped away from the crowd and walked hand in hand to the hotel where they would spend their first night as husband and wife. Tomorrow they would begin planning their journey to Oregon and their new life together. But tonight was for them alone, for whispered words of love, for gentle touches that erased the memory of years apart, for the simple miracle of being together again. "I love you, Mrs. Morrison," Jake said as they paused outside the hotel. "I love you too, Mr. Morrison. Welcome home." And as they climbed the stairs to their room, Martha reflected on the strange arithmetic of love, and loss. She had spent her last $3 to come to Copper Creek, had begged Jake to name his price for a second chance, had waited through weeks of uncertainty not knowing if he was alive or dead. The price had seemed impossibly high. His need to face the demons that had driven him away, the risk of losing him forever just when she had found him again. But in the end, love had proven more valuable than any treasure, stronger than any obstacle, worth any sacrifice. Jake Morrison had finally come home, not just to Copper Creek, but to the life he had always been meant to live. And Martha Sullivan Morrison had her answer to the question she had asked in a dusty stable all those weeks ago. Sometimes the most precious things in life are worth any price you have to pay. 3 months later, as their wagon rolled through the Oregon Territory toward the land that would become their new home, Martha Morrison placed her hand on her still flat belly and smiled. The future stretched before them like an uncharted trail, full of possibilities and promises, and all the dreams they had deferred for too many years. Jake reached over and squeezed her hand, understanding without words what her smile meant. Soon they would have the family they had always planned, the house with the garden, the peaceful life that had seemed impossible during his years as a bounty hunter. Behind them, Copper Creek and Devil's Canyon, and all the ghosts of Jake's violent past were fading into memory. Ahead lay Oregon, springtime, and the chance to plant roses that would bloom for generations to come. The price had been paid in full, and they were finally free to collect their reward. A lifetime of love, laughter, and second chances in a world where anything was possible for two people brave enough to believe in happy endings.